Good morning. It is 11:40 a.m. on Sunday, February 19th, 2017. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just finished an uncomfortable conversation. This is 5 more minutes. So, I'm not going to get into that conversation exactly except that it was politics related and I'm a little bit off balance at the moment. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Today is Sunday, and that means it's time for the rewatch of Avatar The Last Airbender. Season 2, Episode 6. Oh, gosh. One of these days, one of these weeks, I'm going to remember to double check the the episode names before. Oh man. And see, now I'm trying to talk while I type to pull up the episode guide so that I can have the name of the it's a whole thing, you guys. It's a whole thing. The Blind Bandit is the name of this episode. See, I told you guys that I was a little bit off balance. I maybe should have waited half an hour before recording this. But here we are. The Blind Bandit. Finally, we meet Toph. And it's interesting just to, in the rewatch, anyone who has not watched the series before, forgive me a minor spoiler that Toph sticks around for a while. But it's interesting in retrospect during this rewatch to realize how far into the series before we even meet her, just because she becomes such a significant part of the overall story. It's a good episode too. It's return after the last couple to episodes where we're advancing the main plot for the main kids, and in fact, Zuko and Iroh don't even appear this week. But Avatar, Aang and company are still looking to find an earthbending master, and he now has his instructions from King Bumi that he needs a master who will listen to the earth. And so they are, in this Earth Kingdom town. They see an expedition or exhibition, not expedition, an and I was going to say it again. See, guys, I'm just totally... Anyway. An exhibition. And they see a flyer about an earthbending academy. And it turns out that earthbending academy seems like it's a scam. It's unclear, though, completely, because obviously some of the students are doing well at it. But yeah, it's a little bit unclear how they are presenting it, just because it clearly is an actual academy with an actual master, with real students learning real earthbending. But then there are parts of it where they treat it like a scam, and Aang pretty quickly determines that this is not going to be the type of master that he's looking for. But there's also a big earthbending competition that's set up kind of like pro wrestling, where everyone has characters and there's a lot of theatricality about it, and Sokka gets way into rooting for the Boulder, who talks in an aggressive and very affected tone of voice like this. It's kind of fun. And seeing all the different earthbenders in their own various little styles. And it's also a little bit... See, this is another example where it's a little bit unclear how legit this whole thing is, because on the one hand, it does seem very much like pro wrestling, in the sense that you even have like heel characters, like the earthbender who's supposedly from the Fire Nation and makes a big deal about it like that. And yet it seems as though they allow people to come up and compete, and that's all just kind of a they get mad at the cheating, supposedly. It's also a little bit I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm complaining about here. The it's actually a lot of fun watching them watch it, and also how into it Sokka gets. But then we get the surprise reveal because we've seen all of these different characters, and it feels like we're maybe setting up to thinking that the boulder, would he be a good earthbending master? And he seems like he's the best, except that, as Aang points out, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that Bumi told him to watch for. And so then we finally see that the champion is the blind bandit. And so it's this little, it's a young girl who's blind and not very muscular, and it seems like, what? How could that be? But of course, Aang recognizes immediately what she's doing, and she seems obvious to be the choice. And so when there's this offer to anyone in the audience to challenge her, Aang takes it, not because he actually wants to fight her, but just as an opportunity to talk to her. And it's interesting the way it all plays out, because in some ways, even though he's partly just defending himself, if it's an earthbending competition, to take her by surprise using some other kind of bending, even if they didn't make that explicitly against the rules, it's really not how it's supposed to go. And the whole thing, and of course that's what leads the bad guys here to suspect that it's a scam. And it's a little weird. I don't know. There's a lot of complex stuff going on in this episode, because on the one hand, these guys running this fighting ring, in some ways, if they suspect cheating, that is to some extent a rightful, something they have a right to be angry about. But of course, their response is, so let's kidnap them for ransom. Anyway, so they're clearly not these, above board businessmen here. But so, without getting into the sort of the plot by plot, which I think is part of my frustration here, is trying to go through it that way, let's just talk about Toph. And so we set up a couple of things pretty much right away. One is that she's coming from this rich, privileged background where her parents are overprotective, but to also kind of neglectful. So they're very controlling in that respect. And so that's interesting. And so it has forced her as a coping mechanism to develop kind of these two personas. One, which is the helpless little blind girl. Oh, I think I saw something. And then, of course, her fighting persona, which is very kind of sarcastic and pragmatic, and calls Aang Twinkle Toes because of the way he was not making full contact with the ground. But also just this ability that she has is, we can recognize, of course, that it's very much in line with what Bumi was telling him to look for. And let's also just give a shout out to the animators and designers of this show in making each type of bending distinct in terms of what kinds of things you can do and the moves that you use, and what sort of a mental philosophy it can kind of represent. This idea of maintaining a connection, of waiting to move until just the right time, as opposed to Aang with his airbending, where he's almost kind of flighty. He's always moving. He's spinning around and he's dodging out of the way, as opposed to letting your enemy come to you and then taking an action. It's distinct and interesting. And so Toph has been getting some training, but to a large extent she is keeping her real abilities from everybody and finding ways to sneak out and go do other things. They also, so going out and doing this whole fighting ring thing, for example, it's clear that she wants more from her life, and really has only not gone, because there's an interesting duality in the idea that she's actually much more capable than anyone would have expected. She is not, in other words, just a little blind girl. And yet, despite all of these additional capabilities she has, she is still a little blind girl. And her senses give her a lot of ability that most blind people wouldn't have. But that does not, for example, mean that when Sokka tosses her the belt, that she is able to catch it, because it's unlike Daredevil with his radar sense. She gets everything through the ground. So if something's not touching the ground. And so the idea that as young as she is, and with, even though for her, her blindness is less of a disability than it would be for most people with blindness, she's still not prepared to just leave and go somewhere. But where and why, for what? Is she just going to go off on her own? That is, it's kind of a bridge too far, because where would she go? What would she do? And so she bridles or bristles at the control from her parents, but they're her parents. And it's interesting. So it seems that what she really just needed in this context is a quest to go on, a task to do, something to do, an excuse to go out into the world. And Aang and company provide that. And so we end up with, Aang is finally going to have his earthbending master, but we also add a new ingredient into the mix of the Aang gang, our little team avatar here. Because, of course, we have Aang, who, despite having a very serious responsibility and being kind of this chosen one avatar, is also very light and jokey and smiley and optimistic. We have Katara, who's a little more practical and grounded, but very compassionate, takes things seriously, and yet also has some humor to her. Sokka, who is the pragmatic one, who gets annoyed and frustrated when people don't do the sensible thing, but he's got his own bravery to him. And so how will Toph fit into that mix? Well, we'll see, of course, as the series progresses. But she is, not to, she's very grounded, which feels like a pun, except that I believe that it's 100% deliberate. She is very much, along with Sokka, a pragmatist in terms of things are the way they are. So there's not a lot of sense wishing they were different unless you're actually going to do something about it. And yet also there's a vulnerability there. Her sneaking out and not letting her parents know what she's doing. There's a vulnerability in that, because it's a fear of, well, what would they do if they knew how tough she was? And of course, that's what we see, is that once they find out, they decide that they want to just clamp down the control even tighter. And that's what she's afraid of. So we got a lot of good action in this episode too, both with the original earthbending exhibition and with the fight later. I think we knew the detail already that earthbenders can't generally bend metal very well. I don't think we've really gone into it too much. I'm trying to remember what we've seen of that. Right, because even Boomy, when he was in this metal coffin, he couldn't bend that, but he could bend the stone around it with his face. But so we get that element too. And we certainly get it set up that the leader of this fighting ring and the earthbending master are now going to be pursuing pursuing the team in order to get Toph back. Because her father is not willing to relinquish control, and he doesn't want to stop thinking of her as helpless. So clearly they have kidnapped her and she needs to be rescued. But it's interesting that, these two guys, the earthbending master from the academy and the leader of the fighting ring, both seem aware of that dynamic about it. Like, they're under no illusions that they're the heroes coming in to rescue the poor damsel. They mostly just want their revenge. And so we're now, continuing off on the journey for the rest of the season, but with the another piece clicking into place for this team and for Aang to take his next step in his larger journey. So I feel like I haven't talked about this one as much lately. Maybe it's still just because I don't know, on edge or something like that. I have a little bit of a headache too. But it's a good episode, and it's a relief to kind of finally have Toph in the mix, because she's a great character, and I'm really looking forward to watching her integrate more with the team, because, she's fun. All right, so I will be back. Well, let's see. Yes, next week on Sunday, I will be out of town, but the plan is still to talk about the next episode of Avatar then, so I will see you next week from where I am, and we'll talk about episode 7. So, talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.